This video is sponsored by Helsinki Metal Festival 2023.
Hello everybody out there, this is Kai.
And Michael.
And we are booked for the Helsinki Metal Fest as headliners on the
11th of August.
11th.
After all the cancellations and stuff, we're happy to finally come to your country.
Yeah. Come
See you
watch
there
us.
then.
Yeah.
Hails and welcome to Rauta's 5th episode of True Norwegian Black Metal, aka Crash Course to Black Metal from Norway of the 1990s. Now with the previous 4 episodes, quick recap. I've already gone through all the big ones. That is the first roughly maybe 12 bands, which I would call big. And even that is a little bit debatable. But nonetheless, now we are going for the mid-sized one. And of course, people will always argue that size doesn't matter and blah, blah, blah. But that's not the point. I mean, I have the numbers to back me up. Whether it comes to Spotify fans or following or Last FM spins, the total amount of albums being played, or just, social media following. The following 3 bands are somewhat less popular, somewhat less listened, the really, really big ones from Norway. And that is not limited to Dark Throne, Mayhem, Burzum, etc. But obviously those are some of the names that, Norwegian black metal is mostly known for. Even with bands like Immortal, Satyricon, Dimmu Borgir, etc. So since the first 12 bands I mentioned, they are not really that who started it, who made the albums first and all that stuff. So this video series more or less goes from the bigger to the smaller and into the underground. We dig ourselves on the way towards something maybe less known. But this episode features those which I would call runner-ups. Runner-ups meaning they're relatively big. But in case of Norwegian black metal, like said, these are not ready to challenge the really, really big ones. And as such, I indeed would call them mid-sized. The bands today are 1349, Ragnarok and Tsjuder. And of course these bands are all a little bit different from one another. And now it's time to talk a little bit of their discography, introduce maybe some of the key albums, and overall just revisit what was going on with these bands when they started and all that stuff. So here we go. And these are by no means in any certain given order, like which one is the best or whatever. I'm just picking these basically in an order which is somewhat represented by the numbers, talking about from bigger to less big and all that stuff. Now, 1349 almost didn't make it to the list, and the reason is rather obvious. I mean, they're one of the newer bands in terms of 1990s black metal. I mean, the point it really out is that they didn't even have an album before 2003, which is quite late to the party. I mean, a lot of these bands that are mentioned before started already like late 80s. I'm talking about, for example, Mayhem, which was their like mid 80s, and Dark Throne late 80s, and some of the bands pretty much on the verge of 80s and 90s changed, or more like abandoned their death metal and then replaced it with black metal, Immortal being one of those bands. But 1349, they didn't have anything going on until 1998, which is quite late, talking about Norwegian black metal of the 90s. And I've mentioned this probably in every video so far, and I keep mentioning until the very end, I guess, is that around 1997, 1998, lots of Norwegian black metal started to decline in terms of quality. Of course, this doesn't really apply to 1349 because, well, that's when they started. Now, this could be very much for debate, whether they came as saviors to make an impact for that, or whether it's just pure coincidence that they surfaced around the time. That's up to you. But what is worth mentioning is that during those times they have made quite a few albums, and also they have done something different than a lot of other bands. This is something that I want to really point out, that where a lot of other bands decided to go either folkier ways, or all that stuff. Think about bands like Borgnagar or Ulver just abandoning metal for all good and all that stuff. Immortal abandoning their more fierce black metal and becoming more epic. Darkthrone becomes something very, very different than the raw end of black metal in the 1990s, or Bertram just becoming just synthesizer music basically. Now 1349 was like, okay, we'll deliver some fierce, fast and aggressive black metal. In so many ways it kind of reminds me of Marduk, but then again the style is quite different. But the point here still remains the same. While other bands decided to just kind of soften up and becoming something less aggressive, less raw, less extreme than what it used to be in terms of black metal anyway, this was in a way kind of refreshing. And I remember 1349 doing something like Waves when they, became a thing. And I still consider, much like Tsjuder, one of the newer bands. But I mean, obviously, really, when you think about it, 1997, they have been here more than 25 years ago. I mean, I already had my own band back in 1996, but that's beside the point. It feels like eternity nowadays. Even though back in the days, it was a new band to do a new something. 1997 versus the bands that already had like an album out in 1991. Back in the days, 6 years was like eternity. So a new and old band, that's the idea. But like I said, this band has been here for quite some time, and during those times there are quite a few albums. And they have been always quite active, especially the early years. If you really think about it, 2001 being the self-titled EP release year. 2 years after, Liberation, and then just album per year, except there was a little bit of a break after 3 years. And then again, 2009, 2010, and Video 2011, and then another break until 2014. It was time for another album, and then longer break with 5 years and all that stuff. And now one could really make the statement. If you take a look at the members list, now all these band members have other projects. And this is mostly old school lineup. I mean, Frost being the newest one from 2000s. Of course, one could really make guesses that Frost being active with, Satyricon might have affected 1349's career. And that really could have slowed things down, or at least affected them. If you take a look at the previous members, well, there was a couple of other members, and they also had other bands, and still have. So if you really think about it, all these guys, they were active, and they have had or still have other bands. But none of these bands are exactly some of those really, really big names, apart from Frost, which indeed has or still have Gorgoroth, and I mean Satyricon, but has been playing with Gorgoroth, Gehenna, whatever. These other bands, somewhat important, but only in terms of smaller underground things. Now this obviously didn't slow too much 1349 down. In terms of numbers, it's the biggest of this trio which I have here. Once again, proving that when you have things going right, whether it's about music, whether it's about, doing Norwegian black metal in general, and adding the layers of aggressiveness and fast-paced black metal, and doing a little bit more crude ways, it can really go a long way. And of course, doing gigs and whatever you have. Now, my point, or opinion more like, with 1349 is that I never considered them A-class band. And I'll try to explain what I really mean about it. While a lot of these older bands would be considered like having at least 5 out of 5, like a 5-star album really. For Satyricon, for example, it would be, in my case, Nemesis Divina. Darkthrone would have a few of those 5-star albums. And even bands like Mayhem, Emperor, Enslaved, they all at least have at least 1 or 2 of those. But when it comes to 1349, I mean, it's like a hard-working band in the sense of like delivering those fast tempo, really aggressive albums, and not being shy of, having the kind of a cruder end of production with the music and all that stuff. All their albums are pretty listenable, but none of them really click fully. Maybe it's just in my end, but I feel like they are still evolving and becoming better. There's like one, in my opinion, where like a bump on the road where it went kind of downhill. And I'm not the only one. If you really take a look at these scores here. Revelations of the Black Flame, the fourth album. That is really pure mediocrity. And it's almost like whatever the band was doing, they dropped the ball big time. But the good thing is, after that, they kind of were bringing it back maybe better than before. I mean, the early albums, especially Liberation, Hellfire, and blah, 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 they were quite good, but not that 5-star stuff. But the latest album, The Infernal Pathway, is actually one of the better ones. So I'm saying there is still a lot of hope for 1349 one day to make that big album. But so far, in my opinion only, they have been a kind of a B-class band when it comes to quality. That doesn't mean it's not worth listening to or seeing them live, but I'm saying maybe that's one of the reasons why it's not one of the big ones. In hand with the being late to the party aspect. Definitely something to keep your eyes on in case you have missed it and all that stuff, but kind of understandable why this is more like a mid-sized band rather than one of those really big ones. The second band featured here on this episode is Ragnarok, which already kind of had a little bit hiatus or break during the mid part of their career. And this is a band that I already heard for the first time late 90s. I'm not exactly sure which year, but I would say roughly 1996, 1997, because I have a vague recollection that I remember when A Rising Realm was a new album. And I had already heard Not Third. I would say probably late 1996, but could have been early 1997. What it is mean is that back in the days, this wasn't exactly to me one of the newer bands. And then if you really take a look at it, 1994, not that late to the party. I mean, their debut album is roughly the same age as Dimmu Borgir debut for All Tid. But what is curious is that these first two albums are a little bit different than the other ones. And this is probably why here it is mentioned in the themes as well. I mean, it's goes for the lyrics, but also shows in the music is that the first album were more like paganism and Vikings. So you can really hear some folkier or more like Viking stuff even in the songwriting for Not Third. A Rising Realm is then again kind of a Dimmu Borgirian. I mean, you can pretty much hear some kind of Enthrose Darkness triumphant moments there with a lot of synthesizers and, you know, becoming something different than Not Third. And then I think they found their style with Diabolical Age. And that is also, in my opinion, the point when the band kind of went to this crossroads section, which is very typical for a band with their third album. You're like, whether we go that way or that way, there is no coming back or going back. Sometimes there might be a third route. But I guess in this time, it was more about like this T section. You're not going back. So you go for more into the Viking and folkier, kind of a pagan black metal, or then you go for more satanic stuff and you just, I don't know, make it more fierce and also a little bit more typical. But I think they made the right call because since Diabolical Age, I think the band really started to build up a little bit more. And all the albums from that point are, in my opinion, a little bit better than what it used to be. I wouldn't go as far as to say, for example, this latest album from 2019, Non de Bellicata, calling it 55%. I mean, it's just outrageous. Then again, I really wouldn't call none of these albums like 95%. So for what it's worth, in my opinion, the very same thing applies to Ragnarok as for 1349. None of these albums are 5-star album, but they're all very, very listenable and some degree quite enjoyable. Thing here is they mostly have, in my opinion, like 4-star albums. That pretty much sums the whole career. They are not the brightest star in Norwegian black metal by no means, but they also don't have clear weak points. Like there are no major bumps on the road. They do the kind of a basic Norwegian black metal with more satanic themes than the before, but they have always been very, very active. I mean, if you really take a look at this, there are no big pauses, 1995, 97, 2000, etc. So maybe here, 6 years after Black Door, Miracle, and all that stuff. But I mean, mostly it has been all the way down, pretty much going on, and there are no big breaks. However, they never made it that big, and one can only wonder why. It cannot really be blamed purely on the songwriting, so maybe they didn't tour as much and all that stuff, because when it comes to their age or the amount of albums or their style or consistency, nothing really checks out the boxes saying like, okay, this is not on the level of some of the bigger bands which you already know. I mean, when it comes to music, they could really challenge bands like Satyricon, for example. But for some reason or another, they are not there. But maybe this is a good time to remind you of this band, which is definitely right there, doing the hard-working Norwegian black metal the very traditional way, not exactly original or something unique, but also doing some kind of a hard-working black metal, and maybe more approachable than 1349, because these albums are usually, in general, a little bit more better production and not as aggressive as 1349, which might be putting some people off, especially if you're kind of not that into just fast-paced black metal. Which brings us to the last band on this episode, and I think this is also the best one. This is only my opinion only once again, and now I get to reuse those words we used for 1349. I still remember when Tsjuder was a new band, which doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It's 1993, so roughly one of those Oslo-based bands that is one of the older ones. A lot of major Norwegian black metal bands are from bands like Bergen. So Oslo scene, while it's important and all that stuff, maybe never were that much given credit, maybe didn't make that big waves and all that stuff. But the real reason why Tsjuder is considered one of the newer bands is of course because their debut, Kill for Satan, is from 2000s. And much like 1349, they never, decided to, okay, let's do some kind of a melodic black metal in the mid-tempo way. Let's add progressive elements that go a little bit folkier. Already the title says it all. This is going to be some fierce black metal, unapologetic and just kicking your face in. Now, the downside is that these first two albums are not as good as you might think. Despite the cool names and all, I think it's with the third album, Desert Northern Hell, which really just brought the whole band to a different level. I mean, there's a clear gap. Kill for Satan is a decent album, much like your typical 1349 album, but nothing out of ordinary. Demonic possession picks up a little bit, like a different gear, but still something is not like, yeah, it's good, but it's not great. And with Desert Northern Hell, it's all changed. But this was as late as 2004. During these times, already most Norwegian black metal bands decided, let's do something totally different, or had already, gone. Like, for example, Emperor. A lot of bands had changed their style to something totally different, or just abandoned black metal for good. Like Oliver, like Emperor, like Enslaved in a way. So, I think there was a little bit kind of a void that needed to be filled. And Tsjuder became just more and more fierce and aggressive throughout those years. And man, they did it well. When I was revisiting the whole discography here, I was just astounding how good albums all these are coming from the third album and onward. I mean Legion, Helvete, Antiliv, and now the latest album Helveger. There will be a review video, by the way, on the channel. Maybe before or after this video, most likely after. But the thing here is, all these albums are really, really good. They are fast, they are fierce, they are aggressive, but they are not just one-trick pony, let's do one super fast song and pure aggression and just copy-paste it. They have, diversity. They have those changes with tempos and all that stuff. And what really speaks to me is that how much they actually nod towards old-school stuff. I mean, these guys love Bathory. That's kind of a given with their tribute to Bathory album, also 2023. But I mean, you can clearly hear those trashier parts. You can see and feel and listen to all those 1980s parts, which are not so prevalent, not so dominating with a lot of Norwegian black metal albums. It's almost like a lot of Norwegian black metal scene fell in love with itself. Like this classic story from, Greek mythology when this one person, Narcissus or whatever, fell in love with his own image, staring at the pool and oh my God, I'm so good looking, I'm gonna love myself and nobody else. And a lot of Norwegian bands seem like they're taking the ideas from the other Norwegian bands, becoming part of this Norwegian black metal hype train, like Norwegian black metal copulating with one another, and which is very incestuous if you really think about it, and sounds kind of a twisted and sick and all that stuff, and also, in my opinion, led to the downfall from the highest throne in black metal. I mean, take a look at the early 1990s black metal from Norway and albums that came out like maybe 10 years afterwards, and you know what I mean. But instead, Tsjuder decided to go the opposite direction, when other bands just became part of this matrix thing with their long trench coats and becoming something more modern, even abandoning black metal and becoming death metal bands once again. Tsjuder like, hey, fuck it, let's go back in the 1980s. That's where the real good gold is. And let's start digging and picking up ideas from that. And you can hear it, especially with albums like Helveger, Antiliv, or I think it was also in Legion Helvete. You can hear the trashier parts, which are like definitely nodding to old school trash, but also Bathory and the others. Which is, in my opinion, why Tsjuder is, in my opinion, one of the better bands from Norway to do nowadays black metal the Norwegian style. So all these three bands, they are not the biggest, they are not the brightest stars right there, but in my opinion, they are all more or less good bands. And in my opinion, Tsjuder is the best of this trio. That's just my opinion. I'm here to give you a little bit pointers what to listen and what not. Now, if you want to take my advice, listen to the latest stuff by Tsjuder, starting with Demonic Possession, which is then again also over 20 years old. For Ragnarok, I would say roughly the same thing applies here. Maybe somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot for Ragnarok's material, and when it comes to 1349's, the later albums. You can pretty much skip Revelations for 1349, and only if you like the latest two albums, maybe then go back to the early ones. This is just my idea. With Ragnarok, start with any of the albums, but probably go for Notford and Rising Realm only if you like the rest of the albums, because in my opinion, they are not the best. And like said for Tsjuder, the newer and almost the better. But this is just me giving you a rough idea what to expect from these bands and maybe remind you their existence. All interesting bands and definitely worth checking out. Now, towards the episode 6 we go. We will go once again for a little bit different style of, or different set of bands, which are not the biggest, not the smallest, but also not exactly known for their typical Norwegian black metal. So stay tuned for next episode, and looking forward to your comments about the show, about the concept of this video series, and should you have some names you want me to include, feel free to drop them. I already have some 60 names on the list, so I probably have whatever you have there on your list, but if I don't, that will be added. Thanks for your time, and if you liked the video, click like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and bye-bye.